Imagine dawn breaking over the endless forests of Eastern Europe. Silence hangs heavy, broken only by the distant hum of engines and the occasional flapping of wings. Suddenly, the horizon shivers with thousands of glinting steel helmets, thousands of boots, thousands of rifles. You are there. You see tanks emerging like iron beasts from the mist, artillery shells whistling overhead, bombs tearing the earth apart. Every second is life or death. Every breath could be your last. The ground shakes, the sky roars, and you feel the pull of history dragging you into the chaos. This was June 22nd, 1941, a day that would reshape the world. The German war machine, perfected in speed and brutality, was poised against the vast lands of the Soviet Union. Cities, forests, villages, all would bear witness to the storm about to unfold. Welcome, history warriors. I'm Knightley. You're about to witness history like never before. But before the first shots rang out, the stage was already set, the pieces moving with deadly precision. By the spring of 1941, Europe was already a continent transformed by conflict. Cities bore the scars of conquest, and the nervous tension of occupied nations seeped into everyday life. Germany, having seized France, the Low Countries, Norway, and much of Western Europe, had secured itself as the dominant military power on the continent. The rapid success of the Wehrmacht's Blitzkrieg tactics, a combination of mechanized infantry, armored units, and air support, had left the world in awe and fear. Yet even as Hitler celebrated victories in the West, his gaze turned eastward toward the vast, untamed lands of the Soviet Union. The geopolitical situation was complex. Germany and the Soviet Union had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, a non-aggression treaty that divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. In theory, this agreement provided both powers with breathing room. In practice, it was temporary, fragile, and built on mutual suspicion. Hitler, an ardent ideologue, viewed the pact not as a peace agreement, but as a delay, a window to prepare for what he saw as an inevitable confrontation with the Soviet state. Stalin, for his part, seemed willing to accept a temporary lull in hostilities, focusing instead on internal consolidation and industrial expansion. Yet beneath the veneer of diplomacy, both sides braced themselves for the clash that many foresaw as unavoidable. Operation Barbarossa, the code name for Hitler's massive invasion plan, was conceived as the largest military campaign in human history. It would involve over 4 million German soldiers, thousands of tanks, and a comparable number of aircraft, all coordinated across 3 massive army groups, North, Center, and South. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, was tasked with advancing through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, aimed directly for Moscow, the political and industrial heart of the Soviet Union. Army Group South, led by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, would push through Ukraine, seizing farmland, resources, and industrial centers critical to Soviet war production. Together, these forces formed an iron blade, designed to pierce the Eastern Front in a lightning sweep of destruction. The Germans were confident in their plan, but confidence is a fragile ally. The Soviet Union, sprawling across 11 time zones and encompassing forests, marshes, mountains, and endless plains, presented a logistical and strategic challenge unlike anything the Wehrmacht had encountered in Western Europe. Supply lines would stretch hundreds of miles, rail networks differed in gauge, and rivers and forests threatened to slow even the most mechanized units. Despite these obstacles, the German High Command believed speed and surprise would overcome distance and terrain, delivering a decisive blow before winter arrived. The Soviet Union was no passive opponent. Its army, though weakened by Stalin's purges of the late 1930s, remained vast. Millions of troops, tens of thousands of artillery pieces, and thousands of tanks and aircraft could be deployed if the right commands were given. Yet the Red Army faced deep structural challenges. Purges had eliminated many experienced officers, leaving the military with a shortage of competent leadership. Communication networks were fragmented, intelligence capabilities inconsistent, and morale varied widely among units. Stalin's insistence on strict political oversight further complicated decision-making, as officers weighed loyalty as heavily as competence in their actions. Despite these weaknesses, the Soviets had significant advantages. The sheer scale of the country meant that even rapid advances could become overextended. Industrial output, particularly in the Ural Mountains and Siberia, promised that lost territory could be replaced with new equipment and resources. Vast forests, rivers, and swamps could slow mechanized formations, while harsh weather and seasonal conditions posed a constant threat to invaders unprepared for the extremes of Eastern Europe and Russia. Ideology added a profound layer to the conflict. Hitler's vision of Lebensraum, living space for Germany, demanded conquest, colonization, and the removal of perceived obstacles in Eastern Europe. For the Germans, this was not simply military necessity, but a mission imbued with historical destiny. For the Soviets, defense of the homeland was intertwined with survival, national pride, and the protection of a system that, while politically repressive, had mobilized resources and population at unprecedented levels. The stakes were existential for both sides. Failure was not merely tactical, but ideological. The period leading up to the invasion was a tense chess game of maneuvering, deception, and preparation. German intelligence scouted railways, roads, and fortifications across the Western Soviet Union. Spies and reconnaissance units mapped supply routes, bridges, and garrison positions, seeking weak points and vulnerabilities. The Soviets, wary of German intentions, monitored troop movements with reconnaissance aircraft, border units, and intercepted communications. Yet despite warnings, Stalin remained skeptical that Hitler would risk war so soon. This underestimation would cost dearly in the first days of Barbarossa. In Berlin, meticulous planning dominated military discourse. The Wehrmacht rehearsed movements, synchronized air support with armored advances, and stockpiled fuel, ammunition, and rations. Blitzkrieg doctrine emphasized rapid penetration, encirclement, and annihilation of enemy formations. Panzer divisions were paired with mechanized infantry and artillery in precise coordination, while the Luftwaffe's dive bombers were assigned to destroy fortifications, disrupt communications, and sow panic behind enemy lines. Supply trains, maintenance depots, and field hospitals were positioned to support a war that High Command expected to last only months. On the Soviet side, defensive planning focused on strategic depth and attrition. Recognizing that German tactics relied on rapid breakthroughs, Soviet commanders attempted to layer defenses, fortifying key cities, rivers, and rail hubs. Mobilization plans were drafted to bring reserves forward, even as political oversight hindered their execution. Factories were ramping up production of tanks, artillery, and aircraft, though much of it still lay in western regions vulnerable to capture. Intelligence networks, though not perfect, sought to anticipate German movements and provide early warning. The human dimension cannot be understated. Millions of soldiers prepared for a conflict that would demand extraordinary endurance and courage. German troops, seasoned from campaigns in Poland and France, trained for speed, obedience, and aggression. Soviet soldiers, often conscripts, trained under harsher conditions, yet carried the weight of defending homes, families, and cities against a feared enemy. Morale, discipline, and psychological resilience would prove as decisive as firepower and maneuver in the days to come. Beyond the military, civilians were already feeling the pressures of an impending storm. Border towns braced for occupation, families stockpiled supplies, and local militias mobilized. Across the Soviet Union, the government issued instructions for evacuation, stockpiling, and civil defense. Factories increased production, while communities prepared for the uncertainty that war would bring. Across Germany, citizens were briefed on propaganda emphasizing victory and the righteousness of the mission, creating a shared sense of purpose that infused the army with public support. By June 1941, both sides stood on the precipice of history. Germany had concentrated its forces with unprecedented efficiency, combining mobility, firepower, and coordination on a scale never seen before. The Soviet Union, aware of the threat yet hampered by political, structural, and logistical challenges, positioned itself to absorb the initial shock while planning for a protracted conflict. Every general, every soldier, and every planner understood that the coming weeks would decide the fate of nations. And yet beneath the plans, maps, and orders, uncertainty lingered. Could the German Blitzkrieg maintain its momentum across the vast forests, rivers, and plains of the Soviet Union? Could Soviet industry and manpower compensate for early setbacks? Would weather and terrain frustrate mechanized advances? These questions loomed over every decision, every movement, and every deployment. The tension before the invasion was palpable. In Berlin, officers studied maps, adjusted timetables, and issued orders in a tense, urgent rhythm. In Moscow, radio silence alternated with frantic messages to border commanders. On the frontiers, men cleaned weapons, loaded vehicles, and awaited the command that would ignite the largest invasion the world had ever seen. Then came the final hours before June 22nd. German units moved into position with military precision. Soldiers ate hastily, checked rifles, and prepared tanks for the march. Overhead, reconnaissance aircraft swept the borders, confirming positions and potential weak points. The Soviet border units, though alert, awaited orders, many unaware of the scale of the storm about to descend upon them. Every movement, every calculation, every decision was a step toward a historic collision. The stakes were absolute. Victory would reshape Europe. Defeat could mean catastrophe. For the commanders, the soldiers, and the civilians caught between armies, the hours ahead would demand endurance, courage, and the ability to adapt to chaos beyond imagination. And as the first whispers of dawn approached on June 22, 1941, the continent seemed to hold its breath. Birds fled the trees, rivers reflected the grey sky, roads lay silent, and somewhere on the horizon, the engines of war began their inexorable hum. The calm before the storm was over. Europe teetered on the edge of the greatest invasion in human history. The world would soon witness a clash of armies, ideologies, and ambitions so vast that the echoes would last for decades. Every choice, every order, every step would ripple across the Eastern Front. And the soldiers, civilians and commanders who believed themselves ready, would soon discover that preparation alone could not contain the chaos to come. The stage was set, the armies were poised, the continent waited. And then, with the rising sun, history would explode across the vast landscapes of the Soviet Union. The spring of 1941 was a season of preparation, calculation, and tension that stretched across thousands of miles of the European continent. In Berlin, the heart of the German war machine, the halls of the Oberkommando des Heeres, the German High Command, hummed with activity. Maps sprawled across tables, strings connected key cities, arrows marked intended thrusts, and generals leaned close, whispering instructions and adjustments. Every decision, every deployment, every order could tip the scales between decisive victory and catastrophic failure. Hitler, obsessed with speed and audacity, demanded flawless coordination. Each army group had its target, its timetable, its calculated path of destruction. Yet even he could not anticipate every obstacle, every quagmire, every human variable that might bend or break his plans. In the north, Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, prepared for a march through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. Lieb, cautious yet determined, knew the forests, marshes, and rivers of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania could slow progress. Reconnaissance units scouted every road and river crossing, while engineers prepared pontoon bridges for waterways likely to be contested. The Luftwaffe assigned squadrons for air superiority and tactical bombing, tasked with neutralizing Soviet airfields and disrupting communications. Infantry divisions moved into staging areas under cover of night, rehearsing coordinated advances alongside armored units. Lieb's orders emphasized precision and caution. Speed was necessary, but overextension could be fatal. Army Group Center, the spearhead toward Moscow, fell under the command of Field Marshal Fedor von Bock. Known for his stoicism and meticulous approach, von Bock balanced aggression with calculated logistics. The center's panzer divisions, the most mobile and concentrated in the Wehrmacht, would pierce Soviet lines with speed and force. Infantry divisions followed behind, ready to consolidate gains, secure supply routes, and maintain communication with headquarters. The plan called for rapid encirclement of Soviet units, with pockets formed to trap entire formations before they could retreat. Artillery positions were surveyed, ammunition stockpiled, and engineers prepared for the swift repair of railways and bridges that would be essential for sustaining the advance. Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, faced the open steppes and dense river networks of Ukraine. Rundstedt, a master of operational flexibility, recognized that his forces would need to combine speed with adaptability. Ukrainian terrain favored mobility, but it also concealed potential Soviet defenses and ambushes. Supply depots were pre-positioned, tanks and artillery units rehearsed coordination with motorized infantry, and Luftwaffe units practiced combined assaults. Southern units aimed to seize fertile lands, industrial centers, and the key city of Kiev, cutting Soviet forces off from reinforcements while securing critical resources to fuel the German war effort. The Germans had learned lessons from prior campaigns. Poland, France, and the Low Countries had taught the Wehrmacht that mobility and combined arms coordination could overcome even heavily fortified positions. Blitzkrieg doctrine emphasized speed, surprise, and shock. Tanks, mechanized infantry, artillery, and aircraft operated as a single interdependent system. Panzer divisions, supported by motorized infantry, would create gaps in enemy lines, while dive bombers strafed positions and disrupted communications. Artillery barrages softened defenses, and engineers cleared obstacles. Commanders expected each unit to act autonomously when necessary, but always in alignment with the larger strategic vision. Coordination, timing, and communication were essential. Yet challenges loomed. The sheer scale of Operation Barbarossa was unprecedented. 3 army groups, millions of men, and thousands of vehicles and aircraft had to converge and maintain momentum across thousands of kilometers. Supply lines stretched thin, vulnerable to weather, terrain, and enemy interdiction. The Germans had to rely on railways, fuel depots, and forward supply points, all of which could become targets for sabotage or miscalculation. Motorized units, dependent on fuel and mechanical reliability, were particularly vulnerable to delays. Every decision was a gamble, and the margin for error was razor-thin. The Soviet Union, aware of German ambitions but constrained by internal turmoil, prepared in parallel. The Red Army, though weakened by Stalin's purges of the late 1930s, remained vast and formidable. Millions of men could be mobilized, reinforced by thousands of artillery pieces, tanks, and aircraft. Defensive positions were surveyed along anticipated axes of German advance. Cities such as Leningrad, Smolensk, Kiev, and Moscow were fortified, troops trained to endure rapid assaults, while rail networks were repaired and reinforced to enable strategic mobility. Stalin's orders emphasized resilience and the absorption of the initial shock, with a focus on strategic depth trading space for time to regroup, resupply, and counterattack. Political considerations influenced military decisions. Stalin's insistence on strict political oversight often slowed response times and created tension between political officers and military commanders. Nevertheless, experienced leaders like General Georgy Zhukov advocated for realistic defensive measures, strategic reserves, and rapid mobilization plans. The Soviet emphasis on intelligence gathering, reconnaissance, and operational depth reflected a recognition of the Wehrmacht's capabilities. Scorched earth policies were drafted, factories prepared for relocation eastward, and key resources stockpiled to deny them to the invaders. Across both sides, technology played a decisive role. German panzers, particularly the Panzer III and the IV, combined firepower and mobility. Coordinated with mechanized infantry, artillery, and close air support, these tanks were central to Blitzkrieg's shock and speed philosophy. The Luftwaffe, equipped with dive bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance planes, provided critical battlefield intelligence while disrupting Soviet communications and logistics. The Germans also deployed rail-mounted artillery, engineers trained in rapid bridge construction, and motorized supply units. The Soviets, though initially outmatched in mobility and coordination, possessed advantages of depth, resilience, and innovative equipment. The T-34, with its sloped armor and wide tracks, could traverse muddy terrain and withstand hits that would disable German tanks. The KV series of heavy tanks provided formidable defense, though in smaller numbers. Artillery, particularly long-range guns, allowed Soviet forces to strike at German columns from distances beyond effective counterattack. Air forces, though initially vulnerable, were concentrated near key urban and strategic centers, prepared for defensive sorties. Intelligence and counterintelligence shaped the strategic landscape. German reconnaissance units scouted Soviet troop concentrations, fortifications, and supply hubs. Maps, aerial photographs, and intercepted communications were analyzed to identify weak points and optimal paths of advance. Soviet intelligence, though hindered by purges and secrecy, maintained monitoring posts, border reconnaissance, and a network of spies to detect German preparations. Both sides recognized that foreknowledge of enemy movements could determine victory or delay disaster. Logistics, often underestimated, became a silent battlefield. German forces required immense quantities of fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts. Motorized units depended entirely on consistent fuel deliveries, while artillery and infantry relied on a continuous flow of ammunition. Supply convoys, field depots, and rail transport were meticulously planned. Yet the farther the German armies advanced, the more tenuous these lines became. The Soviet Union's vastness offered a counterbalance. Delays, miscalculations, or disruptions could stall even the most disciplined advance. Morale and psychological readiness were pivotal. German soldiers, seasoned by campaigns in Poland, France, and the Balkans, entered the operation confident in their equipment, training, and leadership. Discipline was drilled, obedience enforced, and camaraderie reinforced. Propaganda emphasized the righteousness of the mission, the inevitability of victory, and the historical imperative of Lebensraum. Soviet soldiers, often younger and less experienced, trained under harsher conditions, but drew motivation from the defense of homeland, family, and survival. Political indoctrination, combined with a sense of duty, created a complex psychological landscape that would influence performance under fire. In border towns, civilians sensed the growing storm. Families prepared for displacement, evacuated supplies, and braced for occupation. Local militias organized, communities fortified critical infrastructure, and factories accelerated production of military goods. The war was not only a military endeavor, it was a societal one. The human dimension, resilience, fear, hope, and endurance would prove as decisive as any weapon system. The period leading to June 22nd was a chessboard of movements. German divisions occupied staging areas near the border, vehicles were camouflaged, and troops conducted final drills. Air reconnaissance confirmed targets, engineers tested bridging equipment. Soviet units, meanwhile, conducted exercises, fortified positions, and mobilized reserves. Every movement was calculated to deceive, mislead, or anticipate the other side. Even in these preparatory days, skirmishes occurred, patrols clashed, and tensions mounted. The human element was omnipresent. Commanders walked lines, spoke with officers, and adjusted orders based on weather, terrain, and intelligence reports. Soldiers inspected weapons, loaded vehicles, and rehearsed formations. Signals officers tested communications. Logistics units verified supply chains. Morale, discipline, and readiness were constantly evaluated. Weather, terrain, and geography were silent actors. The forests of the Baltic states concealed movement. Rivers threatened to halt advances. Ukrainian plains offered mobility, but exposed formations to artillery. Roads and railways, critical arteries, could become obstacles or targets. Commanders on both sides knew that mastery of geography, combined with strategy and timing, would shape the first days of the invasion. Even as orders were finalized, uncertainty persisted. Could supply lines sustain rapid advances? Could armored units maintain cohesion under stress? Would intelligence gaps expose flanks or reserves? Could political interference delay critical responses? These questions hovered over every command post, every officer, and every soldier. June approached. The German army, concentrated and meticulously prepared, awaited the signal. The Soviet army, aware but uncertain, readied itself for an attack that many feared would be catastrophic. Factories, rail lines, and fortifications stood as silent witnesses to preparation. Soldiers stood ready, supplies were marshaled, and the continent itself seemed to hold its breath. In the final hours, Commanders issued last-minute adjustments. Maps were studied under lamplight. Orders were whispered. Soldiers checked weapons, polished boots, and prepared tanks. Reconnaissance flights confirmed enemy positions. Across the border, both armies awaited the inevitable signal that would ignite the largest invasion in human history. The tension was unbearable. Every decision, every preparation, every calculation would be tested by fire, steel, and chaos. Victory required not only planning, but adaptability, courage, and endurance. And in the coming hours, the meticulously crafted plans, the millions of men, the tanks, aircraft, and artillery, would collide across a battlefield of unprecedented scale. Every axis of advance, every command decision, every logistical calculation was poised to meet the unpredictability of combat. Soldiers, commanders, and civilians would all be drawn into the maelstrom. The moment of truth was at hand. Silence before the storm. Silence before dawn on June 22, 1941, broke pale and deceptive over the Soviet western frontier. Mist curled through forests, rivers glistened under the early sun, and villages lay silent, unaware of the storm about to descend. And then it came. The first sound of engines, the hum of aircraft, the distant rumble of tanks. In the skies above, German reconnaissance planes swept across the border, confirming positions and calculating trajectories. Pilots adjusted altitudes and headings, their radios crackling with urgent reports. The Luftwaffe's dive bombers, poised to strike, circled overhead, waiting for the precise moment. On the ground, the first Panzer columns rolled forward. Steel treads churned the earth, mud spraying as the mechanized divisions moved in tight formation. Infantry units, their boots striking rhythmically on roads and paths, followed behind, rifles slung and helmets gleaming. Engineers traveled alongside, ready to repair bridges, remove obstacles and clear mines. Artillery pieces thundered in rehearsal, preparing to deliver destruction with surgical precision. Each movement was coordinated, calculated, rehearsed, and yet the human element loomed as unpredictable as the wind over the plains. In the north, Army Group North surged through the Baltic states. Forests and marshes tested mobility, slowing some panzer units. Reconnaissance scouts moved ahead, assessing river crossings and road conditions. Soviet border outposts, startled by sudden artillery and aircraft attacks, attempted resistance. But communication breakdowns left them isolated. Encounters were brief, but brutal. Machine guns spat fire, mortars exploded, and the ground trembled under the shock of advancing armor. Civilians, caught between armies, fled along dirt roads, their fear adding a human urgency to the unfolding chaos. Army Group Center advanced with relentless momentum toward Smolensk and the heart of Soviet power. Von Bock's armored spearheads pierced thin Soviet defenses with terrifying speed. Infantry divisions followed, consolidating gains and securing critical supply routes. The Luftwaffe strafed rail yards, airfields, and communication hubs, turning them into smoldering wrecks. Soviet troops, disoriented by the suddenness of the attack, regrouped in villages and forests, attempting to form defensive lines. Yet the speed of German operations left many units encircled, their retreat cut off by tanks and artillery that seemed to appear from nowhere. To the south, Army Group South moved across the open steppes of Ukraine. Tanks thundered across plains, engines roaring, dust clouds marking their advance for miles. Soviet troops attempted to slow the assault with defensive positions, trenches, and barricades, but mechanized units overwhelmed static lines. Air support strafed roads and destroyed rail convoys. Civilians abandoned farms and villages, carrying belongings and livestock, while artillery shells tore through fields. Kiev, a key objective, lay hundreds of kilometers ahead, yet every mile of terrain required coordination, endurance, and relentless pressure. The first encounters were chaotic, marked by brief skirmishes escalating into massive engagements. Artillery fire shook the earth, tanks collided with obstacles, and infantry charged forward under the cover of smoke and explosions. Soldiers on both sides faced a blend of fear, adrenaline, and uncertainty. Commanders shouted orders, sometimes lost in the din of battle, sometimes delivered with deadly precision. The chaos of communication, combined with terrain and weather, amplified confusion. Bridges became choke points, forests concealed ambushes, villages became centers of contested control. Air battles unfolded simultaneously. German fighters strafed columns, while Soviet aircraft scrambled to intercept. Dogfights erupted over towns, rivers, and forests. Pilots maneuvered at impossible speeds, their eyes scanning the sky for threats while flak and small arms fire streaked around them. Bombs tore into airfields, rail yards, and supply depots, leaving smoldering wreckage and disrupting Soviet mobilization. Communication and coordination became critical, with radio operators relaying movements, target assignments, and reports of enemy activity. Encirclement became a recurring tactic. German commanders aimed to trap Soviet divisions before they could withdraw or regroup. Villages became cages. Rivers, once barriers, became traps when crossed by advancing tanks with artillery support. Soviet troops fought fiercely, attempting to break through or delay, but German coordination, mobility, and firepower often proved overwhelming. Columns of soldiers, tanks, and artillery moved like synchronized waves, pressing relentlessly, leaving little room for maneuver. Even minor terrain features became decisive. Hills offered observation points, forests concealed units, rivers could delay mechanized advance. Engineers worked frantically, building temporary bridges, clearing mines, and repairing destroyed roads. Panzer divisions relied on fuel and ammunition, making logistics a critical factor. Convoys moved tirelessly, supplying units under fire. Every miscalculation could halt momentum. Every delay offered the enemy a chance to counterattack. Communication remained chaotic. Radios crackled with overlapping messages. Couriers raced across fields. Signals flags were raised and lowered as officers attempted to coordinate attacks. In the midst of explosions, smoke, and dust, commanders adapted on the fly. Decisions had to be immediate, flexible, and decisive. Mistakes could cost entire divisions. Success could change the course of battle in hours. In the north, German units faced unexpected resistance. Soviet defenders, utilizing forests and marshes, staged ambushes. Mines, trenches, and barricades slowed columns, forcing engineers to improvise solutions. Yet German coordination allowed rapid overcoming of obstacles. Luftwaffe strikes neutralized reinforcements, artillery softened defensive positions, and infantry cleared villages. Still, progress was slower than anticipated, a warning of the resistance and terrain that would challenge the campaign. In the center, momentum carried German forces forward but strained supply lines. Fuel, food, and ammunition had to move across vast distances. Convoys became vulnerable to attack, weather, and terrain. Infantry marching behind armored columns faced exhaustion, hunger, and constant threat from snipers, mines, and artillery. The speed of advance tested the limits of both men and machines. Army Group South experienced a different challenge. The open terrain favored movement, but exposed columns to counterattack. Soviet forces launched sporadic assaults, utilizing heavy artillery and armor where available. Mines and destroyed bridges delayed tanks, forcing improvisation. Air superiority, contested in certain sectors, determined whether supplies reached forward units on time. Coordination between panzer, infantry, artillery, and air support became the decisive factor in maintaining momentum. Throughout the front, encirclement battles created desperate scenes. Entire Soviet divisions were cut off, their retreat blocked by armored spearheads. Soldiers fought to escape, often moving through forests, rivers, or abandoned villages. German units attempted to contain pockets while maintaining the forward push. Communication, timing, and coordination were critical, and even small errors could lead to breakthrough or collapse. By midday, the invasion was in full swing. Fires raged across towns, smoke and dust mingled in the skies, and the earth trembled under thousands of advancing vehicles. Soldiers, exhausted yet determined, pressed forward. Commanders adapted continuously, responding to resistance, terrain, and weather. The tempo of operations was relentless, each hour reshaping the front lines. In the north, German units neared Leningrad, encountering fortified positions and entrenched Soviet defenders. Mortars and artillery barrages softened defenses, while infantry and tanks advanced in coordination. Civilians fled or hid, caught between advancing armies and collapsing infrastructure. Resistance was tenacious, but German mobility and combined arms tactics allowed gradual progress. In the center, panzer divisions carved deep thrusts toward Smolensk. Soviet forces attempted to establish defensive lines, but German encirclements frequently disrupted organization. Artillery bombardments, Luftwaffe strikes, and rapid infantry advances created chaos. Villages changed hands multiple times, roads became clogged with vehicles, and communication lines were strained to the breaking point. Yet the Germans maintained momentum, adapting to obstacles and resistance with methodical efficiency. The south faced a dynamic battlefield. Tanks moved across plains, encountering pockets of Soviet resistance that delayed progress. Infantry secured key villages, artillery neutralized fortified positions, and engineers repaired damaged infrastructure. Civilians moved in long columns along roads, while soldiers navigated minefields, barricades, and ambushes. Coordination between units, combined with flexible leadership, allowed continued advance despite delays and setbacks. Encirclements intensified as the days progressed. Soviet troops found themselves trapped in pockets, attempting breakout maneuvers under constant fire. Roads became death traps, bridges were destroyed, and artillery shelled retreating forces. German units pressed relentlessly, relying on speed, firepower, and coordination to maintain pressure. Commanders had to balance the desire for rapid advancement with the necessity of securing flanks and supply lines. By the end of the first week, the invasion had transformed the landscape. Villages were reduced to rubble, forests bore scars from tank tracks, and rivers ran brown with debris. Smoke from burning towns rose into the sky, visible for miles. Soldiers, exhausted and hungry, continued to fight, while commanders adapted plans continuously. The scale of destruction, movement, and chaos was staggering, yet the Wehrmacht pressed on, maintaining momentum in the face of unexpected resistance, logistical strain, and the vastness of the terrain. Communication remained a constant struggle. Radios, signals, and couriers were stretched thin. Miscommunication occasionally led to isolated units or delayed movements, but overall coordination held. Commanders relied on initiative at the divisional level, empowering lower-level officers to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. Every decision, every adjustment, every improvisation contributed to the unfolding drama of the battle. The clash of forces was relentless. Artillery thundered, tanks roared, infantry engaged in close combat, and aircraft swooped overhead. Each sector experienced a different rhythm of violence, yet all were connected in a vast tapestry of movement, strategy, and survival. Soldiers faced not only the enemy but exhaustion, hunger, and the relentless pressure of orders and expectations. Commanders made decisions in real time, weighing risk and reward with every maneuver. Even minor setbacks became crucial. A destroyed bridge could halt an entire column, a misfired artillery shell could expose flanks, a delayed supply convoy could stall armored units. Terrain, weather, and human error all influenced the pace and success of operations. The commanders who adapted fastest gained advantage. Those who hesitated risked disaster. By the second week, the German advance in the north approached Leningrad. Yet progress slowed due to fortified Soviet positions and natural obstacles. In the center, panzer spearheads reached the outskirts of Smolensk, encountering organized defenses and counterattacks. In the south, Army Group South pushed toward Kiev, balancing speed with the need to secure supply lines and flanks. The scale, speed, and intensity of the battle created a continuous cycle of adaptation, engagement, and exhaustion across all fronts. Soldiers on both sides faced the psychological weight of combat. Fear, fatigue, adrenaline, and survival instinct shaped behavior. Commanders sought to maintain morale while exploiting enemy vulnerabilities. Civilians navigated the chaos, often fleeing or hiding in the shadow of advancing armies. Every village, forest, river, and road became part of the theater of war, a stage for heroism, tragedy, and endurance. By the third week, momentum remained with the Germans, but cracks appeared. Supply lines strained under the demands of thousands of vehicles and men. Weather and terrain slowed movement, while Soviet resistance adapted. Counterattacks, though initially uncoordinated, began to exploit German overextensions. Encirclement battles continued, yet the Wehrmacht faced growing logistical challenges. And still the advance continued. Smoke and fire marked the battlefield, dust clouds from tank tracks stretched for miles, and aircraft engaged in constant sorties. Soldiers marched, fought, and maneuvered under relentless pressure. Commanders adapted plans with every hour, balancing aggression with caution, speed with sustainability. As June turned to July, the front lines extended across hundreds of kilometers. The initial shock of the invasion had succeeded in disorganizing Soviet defenses, yet resistance hardened. Each city, village, and forest became a contested space. Every step forward exacted a human cost, yet German forces pressed the attack, aiming to deliver the decisive blow before winter. The clash of armies, the chaos of battle, and the relentless pressure of strategy created a spectacle both horrific and awe-inspiring. Soldiers, commanders, and civilians experienced the invasion in 1,000 different ways, yet all were caught in the same tide of history. Every decision, every maneuver, every volley of artillery shaped the outcome of the campaign and foreshadowed the trials still to come. Amid the chaos, subtle shifts began to appear: overstretched supply lines, unexpected resistance, and the first hints that the tide of invasion might not be as unstoppable as planned. The turning point was approaching. The sun rose over the eastern front, pale and cold, illuminating a battlefield already transformed by the first weeks of Operation Barbarossa. Smoke rose from forests, villages, and rail depots, twisting into the sky, painting a tapestry of chaos and destruction. The German advance, seemingly unstoppable, now began to meet the hidden weight of geography, weather, logistics, and increasingly organized Soviet resistance. Each step forward revealed new vulnerabilities, each decision carried more risk, and every commander sensed the precarious balance between momentum and collapse. In the north, Army Group North pressed toward Leningrad. The terrain, rivers, lakes, marshes, slowed the advance. Panzer divisions, once dominant on open roads, now struggled in boggy forest tracks and mud-choked fields. Engineers raced to build pontoon bridges across swollen rivers while avoiding Soviet demolitions. Fuel shortages limited mobility, forcing commanders to ration diesel for tanks and trucks. Even as artillery and dive bombers softened Soviet positions, resistance hardened. Trenches, barricades, and strategically mined approaches slowed German momentum. Civilians fled or hid, adding unpredictability to movements. Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb realized that time was now working against the Germans as Soviet reinforcements moved closer. Army Group Center, spearheading the advance toward Moscow, encountered a different but equally challenging reality. Smolensk, a strategic transport hub, became the site of grinding encirclement battles. Panzer units had created pockets of trapped Soviet forces, but these operations consumed critical time and manpower. Infantry lagged behind, struggling to maintain pace with armored spearheads. Von Bock faced the dilemma of pressing toward Moscow and risking overextension or consolidating gains and losing precious momentum. "The deeper we go, the more precarious every mile becomes," an aide reportedly observed. Intelligence reports indicated concentrations of Soviet reserves hidden behind forests and railways, waiting for the Germans to commit fully. Army Group South advanced through the Ukrainian plains with speed, yet momentum began to falter under relentless resistance. Soviet units, reinforced by reserves, conducted counterattacks aimed at overextended panzer columns. Bridges were destroyed, rail lines sabotaged, and partisans harassed supply convoys. Tank units moving rapidly without infantry support became vulnerable to ambushes. Artillery struggled to reposition across rivers and mud-choked terrain. Even seemingly minor delays created ripple effects across the southern front, reducing the overall tempo of operations. The weather emerged as a decisive actor. Spring rains turned roads to impassable mud, immobilizing mechanized units and creating bottlenecks. Rasputitsa, the infamous season of impassable terrain, slowed supply convoys to a crawl. Fuel and ammunition shipments were delayed, reducing the combat effectiveness of forward units. Soldiers slogged through mud, water, and flooded fields, their boots soaked, their uniforms weighed down. Tanks and trucks sank into quagmires. Horses, still relied upon for transport in some divisions, struggled under the weight of equipment. The Wehrmacht, trained for rapid mobile warfare, found itself vulnerable in a war of attrition it had not anticipated. Soviet resistance, initially fragmented and reactive, began to organize and adapt. Units trapped in pockets were not simply destroyed. They regrouped, conducted counterattacks, and reinforced threatened sectors. Partisans disrupted logistics, ambushed convoys, and sabotaged railways. Moscow and Leningrad, although distant, provided psychological anchors for Soviet soldiers and civilians alike. Experienced commanders such as Georgy Zhukov and Semyon Timoshenko began to exploit the overextension of German units, redeploying forces strategically and coordinating defenses that leveraged terrain and depth. Soviet doctrine emphasized absorbing the initial shock and trading space for time, an approach that would gradually blunt the Wehrmacht's momentum. Encirclement battles, once emblematic of German efficiency, began to stretch resources to the breaking point. Entire divisions became trapped or delayed in sieges, consuming ammunition, manpower, and time. Soldiers within encirclements fought desperately or attempted breakouts under constant artillery fire. Managing these pockets diverted forces from the front, slowed the overall advance, and forced commanders to make agonizing trade-offs between offensive momentum and operational security. Intelligence, once a tool of decisive advantage for the Germans, began to falter. Reconnaissance reports lagged behind fast-moving units. Panzer spearheads occasionally drove into concentrations of Soviet reserves previously undetected. The Soviets, adapting quickly, utilized reconnaissance, local knowledge, and aerial observation to position defenses, ambush units, and disrupt supply lines. German assumptions of rapid Soviet collapse proved optimistic. The enemy was learning, improvising, and exploiting German vulnerabilities with increasing sophistication. In Army Group North, the advance toward Leningrad slowed under the weight of fortified Soviet defenses and natural obstacles. Lieb faced a dilemma: press forward aggressively, risking heavy casualties, or consolidate positions and allow the defenders to strengthen. Artillery barrages and Luftwaffe strikes softened enemy positions, but every gain required careful coordination, time, and manpower. Bridges had to be rebuilt under fire, roads cleared of debris, and pockets of resistance neutralized. Each delay allowed additional Soviet reinforcements to arrive, foreshadowing the prolonged siege that would define the northern campaign. In the center, Smolensk became a symbol of the turning point. Panzer divisions had achieved deep penetration, but sustaining these gains strained logistics, morale, and command structures. Infantry units struggled to keep pace, artillery needed constant resupply, and supply lines became dangerously long. Soviet counterattacks, though initially uncoordinated, began to exploit exposed flanks and isolated units. Communication difficulties compounded operational challenges. Von Bock had to balance the urgency of maintaining momentum with the tactical necessity of securing positions, a tension emblematic of the campaign's turning point. Army Group South faced mounting challenges in Ukraine. Soviet forces, reinforced and organized, established strong defensive lines near key cities such as Kiev. Mines, destroyed bridges, and partisans disrupted German mobility. Tank units advancing without infantry coordination risked ambush, while artillery struggled to maintain effectiveness across rivers and flooded terrain. Supply shortages began to affect morale and endurance. The South, initially seen as an opportunity for rapid victory, now presented the Wehrmacht with a complex and evolving set of obstacles. Weather remained an omnipresent challenge. Sudden thunderstorms reduced visibility, soaked troops and equipment, and transformed roads into rivers of mud. Air operations became difficult and hazardous. Dive bombers and reconnaissance flights struggled to locate and identify targets. Artillery accuracy diminished in rain and mist. Soldiers, already fatigued by long marches and combat, faced exposure, cold, and illness. Even minor delays had cascading effects across front lines, slowing planned operations and creating opportunities for Soviet counteraction. Logistical strain emerged as a central vulnerability. Supply convoys, stretched across hundreds of kilometers, were slowed by terrain, weather, and enemy action. Fuel shortages immobilized armored units, ammunition delays reduced artillery effectiveness, and food scarcity eroded morale. Engineers worked tirelessly to repair roads and bridges, often under fire. Every delay or disruption rippled across the front, reducing the speed and effectiveness of operations. Commanders increasingly recognized that operational success depended as much on supply as on tactical brilliance. Communication, already difficult, became critical and fragile. Radios overloaded, messengers risked artillery fire and ambush, and misinterpretation of orders became increasingly common. Field commanders had to exercise judgment, interpreting strategic intent while managing immediate tactical realities. Small errors could have outsized consequences, from misaligned attacks to isolated units. Coordination challenges became as lethal as enemy action, shaping the course of battle on multiple fronts. Soviet counterattacks began to exploit German overextension in multiple sectors. Reinforced divisions struck at exposed flanks, disrupted convoys, and ambushed forward units. Artillery, often positioned on high ground or behind rivers, inflicted disproportionate damage on armored columns. Soviet tactics evolved quickly, shifting from piecemeal attacks to coordinated operations that aimed to slow, stall, and bleed the German advance. Adaptability, resilience, and strategic depth became critical factors shaping the turning point. In the north, German advances toward Leningrad faced increasingly entrenched opposition. Forests, rivers, and fortified positions slowed momentum. Lieb ordered coordinated artillery and infantry assaults, yet each step forward required careful planning and execution. Civilian displacement added unpredictability to movements. Soviet reinforcements arrived with increasing speed, bolstering defensive positions. The city's fortifications, combined with challenging terrain, ensured that German forces could not simply steamroll toward their objective. Every day of delay reinforced the growing difficulty of achieving rapid victory. In the center, the battle around Smolensk intensified. Panzer spearheads deep in Soviet territory faced fuel shortages, exhausted crews, and deteriorating equipment. Infantry lagged behind, unable to secure flanks or maintain supply lines. Soviet forces conducted persistent counterattacks, exploiting exposed units and rear areas. Encirclement operations consumed critical resources, slowing the march toward Moscow. Commanders had to adapt constantly, balancing ambition with operational reality. Momentum, once the Wehrmacht's greatest strength, now became a source of vulnerability. Army Group South encountered mounting resistance across Ukraine. Soviet defensive lines, augmented by reserves, forced German units to adjust plans continuously. Bridges destroyed, rail lines sabotaged, and partisan attacks compounded operational difficulties. Tanks operating without infantry support became vulnerable to counterattacks. Artillery, delayed by terrain and logistics, could not always provide timely fire support. The South, initially seen as a relatively open axis of advance, revealed the complexities of sustained offensive operations across vast and contested terrain. Intelligence revealed the scope of Soviet adaptation. Reconnaissance identified concentrations of forces, defensive fortifications, and likely ambush points. Local knowledge and partisan networks provided actionable insight. German planners realized that initial assumptions of rapid Soviet collapse had been overly optimistic. The enemy was learning, responding, and exploiting German weaknesses. Each new report prompted revisions to operational plans, yet the pace of advance and the scale of the front made comprehensive adaptation difficult. Command tensions intensified. Hitler demanded rapid progress toward Moscow, emphasizing ideology and the imperative of decisive victory. Field marshals, aware of logistical realities and environmental constraints, argued for caution and consolidation. Orders were sometimes contradictory. Commanders were forced to interpret intent while managing the immediate challenges of terrain, weather, enemy action, and supply. Each decision carried immense consequences for men, material, and the unfolding campaign. The human dimension weighed heavily on both sides. Soldiers endured continuous combat, fatigue, hunger, and psychological strain. Commanders balanced objectives, casualties, and available resources under constant pressure. Civilians navigated the chaos, fleeing, hiding, or attempting survival amid advancing and retreating forces. Every day brought uncertainty, fear, and difficult choices. The tide of battle tested endurance, courage, and adaptability in ways that would shape the campaign's outcome. As June gave way to July, the turning point became undeniable. German momentum slowed, supply lines groaned under the weight of extended operations, Soviet resistance hardened, reinforced by new troops, better coordination, and adaptive tactics. Weather, terrain, and logistical challenges combined to slow the advance. Even as victories were won, the Wehrmacht faced the limits of operational reach. Momentum alone could no longer guarantee success. In the north, progress toward Leningrad stalled. Soviet fortifications, terrain, and reinforcements slowed the German advance. Encirclement operations consumed resources. Lieb faced a growing awareness that the city would not fall quickly. Artillery and air support, though effective, could not compensate entirely for stretched supply lines and reinforced opposition. In the center, Smolensk remained contested. Panzer units had achieved tactical victories but were increasingly isolated and strained. Soviet counterattacks, logistical shortages, and terrain challenges slowed progress. Von Bock balanced consolidation with ambition, aware that every delay allowed Soviet forces to strengthen defenses toward Moscow. In the south, the advance through Ukraine faced growing obstacles. Partisan activity, destroyed infrastructure, and reinforced Soviet positions slowed movement. Supply issues limited armored operations. Commanders struggled to maintain momentum while securing flanks and sustaining logistics. Even minor delays became strategic vulnerabilities. By mid-July, the turning point was clear. German forces, initially advancing with speed and confidence, now faced a combination of environmental, logistical, tactical, and human constraints. The Soviets, learning from early losses, were adapting, counterattacking, and exploiting vulnerabilities. What had begun as a seemingly unstoppable blitzkrieg was now entering a phase of attrition, uncertainty, and mounting risk. The first cracks in the German offensive foreshadowed the long struggle ahead. Supply lines strained, soldiers fatigued, and commanders weighed the limits of ambition. Weather, terrain, and human endurance imposed themselves as decisive factors. Soviet forces, though battered, were reorganizing, reinforcing, and preparing for the coming months of resistance. The German advance was immense, but the deeper they went, the more tenuous their position became, historian Anthony Beevor later observed. The turning point was not a single event, but a convergence of factors: terrain, weather, logistics, resistance, and strategic decision-making that collectively began to slow the Wehrmacht and shift the balance of initiative. As July unfolded, it became evident that Operation Barbarossa, once a campaign of rapid conquest, was entering a phase defined by attrition, adaptation, and uncertainty. Momentum alone would not determine victory. Endurance, strategy, and the ability to adapt to unforeseen challenges would shape the course of the Eastern Front. The turning point was complete. The Wehrmacht, while still formidable, faced its first major operational crisis. Soviet forces, resilient and adaptive, had begun to shape the battlefield on their terms. The drama of Barbarossa had shifted from rapid conquest to a battle for sustainability, endurance, and the capacity to endure the unforeseen. The consequences of this turning point would ripple across the front, reshaping strategy, morale, and the human cost of the campaign. The aftermath of the initial phase of Barbarossa would set the stage for months of brutal and transformative struggle. The smoke began to settle over the vast expanse of the Eastern Front, but the battlefield remained a landscape transformed. Villages that had once thrived lay in ruins. Railways, roads, and bridges were torn apart by artillery and retreating forces. Forests bore the scars of mechanized warfare. The initial shock of Operation Barbarossa had passed, and the consequences of the German invasion were now clear. The tide of war had shifted, not decisively yet, but in ways that would shape the conflict for years to come. Across the north, Army Group North had reached the outskirts of Leningrad, but the city remained defiant. German forces had secured surrounding areas, yet the terrain, fortified defenses, and stubborn resistance limited further progress. Encirclement operations began, turning the area into a prolonged siege theatre that would endure for months. Villages along the advance were either abandoned or destroyed. Civilians fled, seeking safety in forests or across rivers. Soldiers, exhausted by weeks of combat and supply shortages, were forced into static operations, artillery bombardments, trench construction, and patrolling, rather than the rapid movement they had mastered during the initial assault. In the center, the aftermath of Smolensk's battles was stark. Soviet forces, though forced to retreat, had avoided total annihilation, establishing defensive positions further east. German forces occupied towns and infrastructure, but their momentum toward Moscow slowed. Roads were clogged with vehicles, mud, and wreckage, while supply lines struggled to support advancing divisions. Infantry units, stretched thin, were tasked with maintaining control over occupied towns, managing prisoners, and securing transport corridors. Panzer divisions, once spearheads of rapid advance, required constant maintenance and fuel, limiting their operational flexibility. Army Group South had captured significant portions of Ukraine, including strategic towns and rail hubs. Yet each gain came at a cost. Supply lines stretched across open plains, exposed to partisan activity and sabotage. Bridges destroyed by retreating Soviet forces delayed operations, while reinforcements were forced to navigate contested terrain. Despite victories, German commanders began to realize that controlling the land did not equate to controlling the people, the infrastructure, or the broader operational tempo. The human landscape of the South civilians, displaced populations, and local resistance created unpredictability that equipment and tactics alone could not resolve. Territorially, the Wehrmacht had gained enormous swaths of land in just weeks. From the Baltic states through Belarus to the heart of Ukraine, Germany now controlled key cities, roads, and railways. The vastness of the conquest, however, created new challenges. Holding territory required manpower that could have been used at the front, and securing supply lines over hundreds of kilometers became an operational nightmare. What was conquered in speed now required effort to consolidate, maintain, and defend. The expanses of the east, with forests, rivers, and plains, transformed rapid victories into prolonged campaigns of endurance and attrition. Strategically, the invasion revealed both the strengths and vulnerabilities of the German approach. Blitzkrieg, the doctrine of rapid armored thrusts combined with air power, had achieved remarkable success in the opening weeks. Soviet defenses had been shattered in places, entire divisions encircled, and infrastructure disrupted. Yet the deeper the Wehrmacht advanced, the more tenuous its position became. Supply lines lengthened, forces became dispersed, and operational tempo was constrained by logistics and terrain. Commanders faced the sobering reality that speed alone could not overcome the vastness of the Soviet Union or the resilience of its people and military. The human consequences were profound. Soldiers on both sides faced extreme fatigue, hunger, and exposure to the elements. Casualty numbers, though often disputed, were staggering. Thousands of Soviet troops were killed, wounded, or captured. Thousands of German soldiers suffered losses in combat, disease, or mechanical accidents. Civilians bore the brunt of the invasion, fleeing from advancing armies, losing homes and livelihoods, or trapped in conflict zones. Refugee columns stretched along roads and through forests, carrying belongings, livestock, and fear, creating humanitarian crises that would endure for years. Psychologically, the campaign reshaped perceptions of the war. The Wehrmacht, previously seen as nearly invincible, faced its first operational limitations. Morale among German troops, though initially high due to rapid gains, was challenged by supply shortages, fatigue, and the scale of the territory they had to hold. Conversely, Soviet forces, though battered, experienced a renewed determination. Initial setbacks were reframed as opportunities to regroup, adapt, and resist. Civilians and partisans contributed to a sense of resilience that would gradually sap the momentum of the invaders. Economically, the invasion disrupted key regions. Industrial centers, farms, and infrastructure were damaged or destroyed. Rail networks, critical for moving men and material, were sabotaged or wrecked by retreating forces. Agricultural production, particularly in Ukraine, was interrupted, affecting food supply for both military and civilian populations. German forces attempted to secure resources to sustain the advance, yet the scale of occupation meant that local production could rarely meet the demands of mechanized armies. In the north, the approach to Leningrad marked the beginning of a prolonged strategic stalemate. German forces, unable to quickly capture the city, settled into a siege strategy. This required holding territory around the city, maintaining supply lines, and managing both military and civilian challenges. Soviet defenders prepared for a drawn-out resistance, fortifying positions, stockpiling supplies, and organizing local militias. The siege would consume resources, time, and attention, tying down forces that could have been used elsewhere on the front. In the center, the slowing advance toward Moscow highlighted operational limits. German commanders faced the dual challenge of maintaining momentum while addressing stretched supply lines, exhausted troops, and deteriorating infrastructure. Encirclement operations, though tactically effective, required significant manpower and time, diverting resources from the push toward the capital. Roads clogged with vehicles and mud, rivers and destroyed bridges delayed movement, and the sheer scale of the front revealed the limits of Blitzkrieg as a doctrine, when confronted with geography, logistics, and determined resistance. In the south, the occupation of Ukraine brought both strategic and operational dilemmas. German forces controlled key cities and transport hubs, but faced persistent threats from partisans, logistical vulnerabilities, and overstretched supply lines. Reinforcements required long marches across contested terrain, exposing them to ambush and delay. Holding territory demanded garrison forces, further reducing the manpower available for continued offensive operations. The complexity of the operational environment foreshadowed the challenges the Wehrmacht would encounter in the coming months, particularly as winter approached. Civilian populations were dramatically affected across all sectors. Displacement, food shortages, and disruption of local governance created widespread instability. Refugees moved in massive columns, seeking safety in forests, rural areas, or distant cities. Families were separated, communities destroyed, and social structures strained. Disease and malnutrition became prevalent, compounding the suffering caused by the invasion. Partisan movements began to emerge more visibly, fueled by anger, desperation, and the desire to resist occupation. These human factors added a persistent layer of operational complexity for the Wehrmacht. Military consequences extended beyond immediate losses. Soviet command structures adapted rapidly. Surviving divisions regrouped, reinforcing key positions and establishing defensive lines that would slow future German advances. Logistics, previously a German advantage, now became a vulnerability. The longer distances and hostile territory created delays that the Soviets exploited, laying the groundwork for counteroffensives. German commanders increasingly faced decisions where tactical gains had to be weighed against operational sustainability, reshaping strategy on the Eastern Front. The psychological impact on soldiers was profound. German troops, initially confident in the rapidity of their advance, confronted the reality of overextension, logistical strain, and determined resistance. Morale was tested as progress slowed, casualties mounted, and the vastness of the territory created a sense of isolation. Soviet soldiers, conversely, gained confidence from surviving encirclements, reorganizing, and repelling attacks. Resilience, adaptation, and the will to endure emerged as critical factors shaping the course of the conflict. Infrastructure damage across the front was immense. Rail lines, roads, bridges, and communication hubs were destroyed by artillery, airstrikes, and sabotage. Repairing these systems required time, manpower, and materials, all of which were in short supply. German efforts to maintain operational tempo were hampered by these limitations. The Soviets, meanwhile, leveraged destroyed infrastructure as a defensive tool, slowing German advances and buying time for reinforcements. The interplay between movement, supply, and infrastructure became a defining element of the campaign. By July, the consequences of the initial German advance were clear. Territorial gains were significant, but fragile. Momentum, once a decisive advantage, was now tempered by logistical strain, human endurance, and environmental challenges. Soviet resistance, though previously disorganized, had reorganized, adapted, and exploited weaknesses in German operations. The turning point had shifted the operational narrative. Speed alone would no longer guarantee success, and the war in the East was entering a protracted, grueling phase. Commanders on both sides adapted to these realities. German field marshals attempted to consolidate gains, secure supply lines, and maintain pressure despite growing constraints. Hitler's strategic vision emphasized rapid victory, yet field realities demanded caution, adaptation, and compromise. Soviet commanders prioritized strategic depth, defensive coordination, and the preservation of forces, preparing for a long struggle that would test endurance and ingenuity. The tension between strategic vision and operational capability became a defining feature of the Eastern Front. Human suffering, though not always quantifiable, was profound. Soldiers faced exhaustion, malnutrition, and constant danger. Civilians endured displacement, loss of property, and the collapse of local services. Refugee populations moved across vast distances, carrying possessions and hope, yet encountering danger at every turn. Disease, hunger, and fear became constant companions. Partisan activity emerged both as resistance and survival, complicating German occupation efforts and reinforcing the resilience of the civilian population. Territorial control came at a cost. German forces occupied cities and infrastructure, but required garrisons to hold them, diverting manpower from the front lines. Roads and bridges needed constant repair, fuel depots required protection, and rail lines had to be maintained under constant threat. The expansiveness of the territory created both strategic advantage and operational liability. Every victory demanded effort, every mile held demanded vigilance. The aftermath of Barbarossa's initial phase reshaped the Eastern Front. German forces, though initially successful, now faced logistical, operational, and environmental constraints. Soviet forces, though initially battered, had adapted, reorganized, and prepared for prolonged resistance. The stage was set for protracted engagements, attritional warfare, and a struggle in which endurance, strategy, and adaptation would define success. Strategically, the campaign demonstrated that operational brilliance could be limited by terrain, weather, logistics, and human resilience. Blitzkrieg had achieved rapid victories in Western Europe, yet the Eastern Front presented a scale and complexity unmatched in previous campaigns. Commanders had to account for distances measured in hundreds of kilometers, vast civilian populations, and supply chains stretching across unforgiving terrain. Each decision carried amplified consequences, shaping the operational and human landscape of the front. By late July, the first lessons of Barbarossa's aftermath were evident. Speed and firepower had yielded initial victories, yet the operational ceiling had been reached. Supply lines were stretched, troops were fatigued, infrastructure was damaged, resistance was adaptive. The German advance could no longer be assumed unstoppable. Soviet forces, reinforced and reorganized, were poised to contest future operations with increasing effectiveness. The war in the East, once conceived as a campaign of rapid conquest, was evolving into a protracted struggle of endurance, attrition, and strategic depth. The human toll, both military and civilian, would resonate for years. Casualties mounted, refugees fled, and social structures collapsed in occupied areas. Soldiers endured physical and psychological strain, commanders faced impossible choices, and civilians struggled to survive amid the chaos. Yet amidst this suffering, resilience emerged. Partisans and organized military units resisted, rebuilt, and prepared for the battles to come. The consequences of Barbarossa's opening phase set the stage for a brutal, prolonged conflict that would define the Eastern Front of World War II. Even as the smoke cleared, the implications were unmistakable. Territory alone did not guarantee operational success. Momentum, once a key weapon, was now tempered by logistical and environmental realities. Human endurance and adaptability emerged as decisive factors. The Eastern Front had shifted from a campaign of rapid conquest to a struggle for control, sustainability, and resilience. Every gain came with a cost, every mile held required effort, and every decision had profound implications for the weeks and months to come. The aftermath of Barbarossa's initial phase left a battlefield scarred by destruction, yet alive with movement, strategy, and the persistent drive of human will. Soldiers, civilians, and commanders alike faced the realities of prolonged conflict. The campaign had begun with spectacular speed, but now the true war had begun. A war defined not only by firepower, but by endurance, adaptability, and the human capacity to endure the impossible. The Eastern Front was no longer a landscape for rapid victory. It had become a theater of endurance, complexity, and struggle, where every decision, every movement, and every human effort would shape the course of history. The aftermath of Barbarossa was clear. The war in the East would be fought over months and years, across territory vast enough to test the limits of logistics, strategy, and human resilience. As commanders and soldiers grappled with these consequences, historians would later reflect on the lessons of Barbarossa, lessons in leadership, planning, logistics, and the human cost of ambition. The reflection and analysis that follow reveal the depth of strategic insight gained from this monumental campaign. As the dust settled on the first phase of Operation Barbarossa, historians and strategists would return repeatedly to this campaign to extract lessons about the interplay of ambition, planning, logistics, and human endurance. The German invasion of the Soviet Union remains one of the most studied military operations in history, not only for its scale and speed, but also for the stark contrast between initial success and the vulnerabilities that emerged as the campaign unfolded. From a strategic perspective, Barbarossa illustrates the complexity of operational planning at extreme scales. Hitler's directives demanded rapid and decisive victories, envisioning Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev falling before the onset of winter. Yet the operational reality of managing multiple army groups across vast distances exposed critical tensions between strategic intent and logistical capability. Field commanders often found themselves balancing the desire for speed with the need to consolidate gains, repair infrastructure, and sustain forces tasks that could not be accomplished without careful foresight. Army Group North, advancing toward Leningrad, demonstrated the limits of Blitzkrieg in difficult terrain. Forests, marshes, and rivers slowed mechanized units, forcing commanders to divert infantry and engineers to securing supply lines, repairing bridges, and fortifying captured positions. The rapid advance, initially celebrated as brilliant, required a constant influx of resources. Without adequate fuel, ammunition, and food, even the most disciplined units risked stagnation. Lieb's cautious approach highlighted an enduring lesson: operational speed must be tempered by sustainability. In the center, the march toward Moscow underscored the interplay of tactical brilliance and strategic vulnerability. Panzer spearheads achieved remarkable successes, encircling Soviet forces and capturing key cities. Yet these victories came at the cost of extended supply lines and fatigued troops. Von Bock faced the perennial challenge of balancing operational momentum with the logistical realities of a front stretching hundreds of kilometers. Historian David Glantz noted, Barbarossa's early successes masked the structural vulnerabilities of the German army. The further they went, the more exposed they became. Army Group South revealed the human and operational complexity of controlling conquered territory. Captured towns and infrastructure provided strategic advantages, yet maintaining control over the population, defending supply lines, and securing rail and road networks required significant manpower. Partisan activity disrupted movement, sabotaged equipment, and diverted attention from frontline operations. Commanders learned quickly that conquering land was only one part of operational success. Controlling it demanded resources, intelligence, and careful management of civilian interactions. Leadership emerged as a critical determinant of outcomes on both sides. German commanders excelled at tactical innovation, rapid maneuver, and aggressive pursuit. Yet strategic decisions imposed from above sometimes conflicted with operational realities. Hitler's insistence on rapid victories often pressured field commanders to overextend their units, increasing vulnerability to weather, supply shortages, and counterattacks. Conversely, Soviet leadership demonstrated remarkable adaptability. Commanders such as Georgy Zhukov and Semyon Timoshenko rapidly reorganized battered units, coordinated defenses across multiple axes, and used intelligence and terrain to slow and frustrate the German advance. This contrast highlights the interplay of initiative, flexibility, and centralized vision in shaping operational outcomes. Planning, both at the strategic and tactical levels, proved decisive. German plans assumed rapid collapse of Soviet defenses and relied on speed, surprise, and combined arms coordination. While these assumptions held in the initial days, they failed to account for depth of Soviet reserves, geographic challenges, and logistical constraints. Soviet planners, meanwhile, embraced strategic depth, allowing initial losses while preparing for counter-offensives and defensive consolidation. The juxtaposition of these planning approaches underscores a key lesson. Assumptions must be continuously tested against reality, particularly in campaigns of unprecedented scale. Logistics, often overlooked in popular narratives of Blitzkrieg, emerged as a decisive factor. The German advance relied heavily on fuel, food, ammunition, and spare parts, all transported over extended and often contested supply lines. Early successes masked emerging vulnerabilities. Roads became clogged, vehicles broke down, and fuel shortages immobilized armored divisions at critical moments. The importance of engineers, repair crews, and logistical planning cannot be overstated. As historian Anthony Beevor observes, the Wehrmacht could conquer ground faster than it could sustain its forces. Barbarossa's operational ceiling was set by logistics, not combat ability. Technological considerations also shaped the campaign. German tanks, artillery, and aircraft were highly effective in open terrain, but they faced limitations in mud, forests, and extreme weather. Maintenance became a constant concern. Infantry weapons, communication systems, and field artillery all required support to remain effective over prolonged distances. Soviet technology, while initially outmatched in certain areas, benefited from adaptation and quantity. Tactics and training allowed Soviet units to compensate for technological disparities, exploiting terrain and resilience to blunt German advantages. The campaign thus illustrates how technology interacts with terrain, logistics, and human factors to shape outcomes. The human dimension of Barbarossa reveals lessons in endurance, morale, and psychological resilience. Soldiers faced exhaustion, hunger, exposure, and the strain of continuous combat. Field commanders balanced mission objectives with the health and sustainability of their units. Civilians navigated displacement, destruction, and uncertainty, while partisans and local militias contributed to operational complexity. The ability to endure adversity, adapt to changing circumstances, and maintain cohesion under stress proved as decisive as firepower or strategy. The interaction between terrain and operational planning is another critical insight. Eastern Europe's forests, rivers, marshes, and plains presented obstacles that slowed mechanized operations and forced improvisation. Spring rains transformed roads into mud, immobilizing vehicles and straining supply chains. Rivers required pontoon bridges or detours, while forests provided cover for Soviet counterattacks. Commanders learned that operational assumptions must integrate geography and climate, particularly in campaigns spanning hundreds of kilometers. Operational brilliance alone could not overcome the physical environment. Intelligence and reconnaissance played pivotal roles in shaping outcomes. Early German successes relied on surprise and accurate information, yet as the front expanded, intelligence lagged behind advancing units. Reports became outdated, reconnaissance units were stretched thin, and German forces occasionally advanced into prepared Soviet defensive zones. Conversely, Soviet intelligence and local knowledge allowed effective redeployment of reserves, the establishment of ambushes, and disruption of German logistics. Effective intelligence requires not only collection, but rapid interpretation and actionable implementation, an enduring lesson from Barbarossa. Coordination among different branches of the military was essential yet challenging. The Wehrmacht relied on integrated operations of infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. While effective in controlled engagements, extended fronts and rapid advances strained command structures. Communication failures, delayed orders, and logistical mismatches occasionally reduced combat effectiveness. Soviet forces, initially less coordinated, adapted quickly, leveraging artillery, infantry, and reserves in a more flexible manner as the campaign progressed. This demonstrates the importance of joint operations and interbranch cooperation in large-scale campaigns. Leadership under uncertainty emerged as a defining factor. German commanders faced tension between strategic directives from above and the realities on the ground. Decisions often involved trade-offs: press forward aggressively and risk overextension, or consolidate gains and risk losing momentum. Soviet commanders, conversely, exercised initiative within strategic frameworks, leveraging the defensive depth and flexibility of their forces. Both examples underscore that leadership in large-scale conflict is not solely about issuing orders, but about interpreting intent, managing risk, and adapting to evolving circumstances. The campaign also highlights the consequences of overextension. Initial victories created operational momentum, but extending forces over vast distances created vulnerabilities. Supply lines became stretched, armored units outran infantry support, and pockets of isolated troops emerged. Soviet counterattacks, terrain, and logistical challenges began to erode the advantages gained in early stages. Overextension illustrates a timeless principle of warfare. Rapid advance without consolidation can create critical weaknesses that opponents can exploit. Operational resilience is another lesson. The Soviets, despite initial losses, demonstrated remarkable capacity to absorb shock, reorganize, and counterattack. Strategic depth allowed them to trade space for time, fortify critical positions, and preserve forces for future operations. The contrast between German speed and Soviet resilience underscores the importance of endurance and adaptability in sustained conflict. Short-term victories, no matter how spectacular, may be insufficient if they cannot be leveraged into lasting operational advantage. Lessons in logistics extend beyond supply lines to infrastructure and repair. Engineers, maintenance crews, and logistics planners became as important as frontline units. Tanks immobilized by mud or mechanical failure required rapid repair to remain effective. Artillery units needed resupply and positioning. Roads, bridges, and railways had to be maintained in hostile and changing terrain. Barbarossa demonstrated that logistics is not merely support for combat, it is a central determinant of operational capability. Command flexibility and adaptability emerge as recurring themes. German field commanders occasionally displayed operational brilliance, improvising solutions to overcome obstacles, yet strategic directives often limited flexibility. Soviet commanders, forced to adapt after initial setbacks, increasingly coordinated reinforcements, counterattacks, and defensive positions in ways that compensated for initial disadvantages. The interplay between hierarchical control and decentralized decision-making highlights the complexity of leadership in large-scale operations. Weather, often underestimated in planning, proved decisive. Spring rains and the Rasputitsa transformed roads into impassable quagmires, immobilizing vehicles and slowing infantry. Flooded rivers and swollen streams disrupted movement, while sudden storms reduced visibility and hampered air support. These environmental factors remind us that even highly disciplined and technologically advanced forces are constrained by nature, and effective planning must integrate climatic realities into operational design. The interaction between human endurance and operational tempo is another key insight. Soldiers faced continuous exertion, long marches, combat, and exposure to harsh conditions. Fatigue reduced combat effectiveness, slowed decision-making, and increased vulnerability to errors. Commanders had to account for the limits of human endurance in scheduling operations, rotating units, and planning objectives. Barbarossa demonstrates that the human dimension of warfare psychology, stamina, and morale is inseparable from strategy, logistics, and technology. Soviet adaptation offers lessons in learning from adversity. Initial defeats were rapidly analyzed, with lessons applied to subsequent operations. Defensive lines were reinforced, counterattack tactics refined, and supply and communication structures improved. This capacity for iterative learning highlights a critical principle. Resilience and adaptability can offset technological or tactical disadvantages, particularly in prolonged campaigns. Barbarossa also reveals the limits of centralized control in dynamic operations. Strategic directives from Berlin often conflicted with operational realities on the ground. Field commanders were forced to interpret intent, improvise solutions, and manage competing priorities. Effective leadership therefore required not only obedience but judgment, creativity, and the ability to reconcile vision with reality. Finally, technology and human factors were inseparable in shaping outcomes. German tanks, aircraft, and artillery were highly effective tools, yet without fuel, maintenance, coordination, and trained crews, their potential was limited. Soviet forces, initially less technologically advanced in certain areas, leveraged numbers, adaptation, and resilience to neutralize some advantages. Technology enhances capability, but cannot replace planning, endurance, or adaptability. The reflection on Barbarossa's first phase underscores enduring lessons. Operational brilliance must be integrated with logistics and sustainability. Speed and momentum are powerful, but limited by terrain, weather, and human endurance. Resilience and adaptability can offset initial disadvantages. Leadership requires both vision and practical judgment, and technological advantage must be matched by operational support and human capacity. Barbarossa serves as a case study in the convergence of strategy, planning, logistics, technology, and human endurance. The German invasion achieved spectacular initial successes, yet revealed vulnerabilities that would define the Eastern Front. Commanders, soldiers, and civilians all faced unprecedented challenges, testing the limits of human capacity and operational design. The lessons extracted from this campaign remain relevant to military planners, historians, and strategists to this day. The turning point, the aftermath, and the human consequences converge into a single insight. Success in war is determined not solely by victories, but by the ability to sustain, adapt, and endure over time. Barbarossa demonstrated that even the most powerful forces, equipped with speed, firepower, and initiative, are constrained by the realities of terrain, climate, logistics, and human endurance. The Eastern Front would continue to demand resilience, adaptation, and strategic insight from all involved. As we look back on these lessons, the final reflection draws the narrative together, offering a cinematic close to Barbarossa's story and a glimpse of what comes next on the Eastern Front. The human, strategic, and technological drama of this campaign sets the stage for future episodes of endurance and resistance. Imagine standing on the edge of the Eastern Front, as the sun dips behind the forests of Russia, smoke rising from distant villages, rivers reflecting the chaos of a war that seems endless. The first weeks of Operation Barbarossa burned across the landscape like wildfire, achieving rapid victories, encircling armies, and seizing territory that spanned hundreds of kilometers. Yet the very scale of the conquest revealed a sobering truth. Speed alone could not sustain an empire in motion. Logistics strained, soldiers endured exhaustion, civilians fled, and the land itself resisted with rivers, mud, forests, and winter to come. From the Baltic shores to the plains of Ukraine, from the burning towns of Smolensk to the outskirts of Leningrad, the story of Barbarossa is one of ambition meeting reality. German forces pushed relentlessly, yet the human, environmental, and logistical limits became evident. Soviet resilience, adaptation, and the relentless will to endure turned early momentum into a grueling struggle. Every tactical victory carried strategic vulnerability. Every advance demanded careful management of men, materiel, and terrain. Barbarossa reminds us that history is never a straight line. Victory is temporary without endurance. Brilliance falters without preparation. Human will can defy technology, and adaptation can overcome initial setbacks. Thank you for journeying through this monumental campaign. If you were captivated by this story, like, comment, and subscribe to join our next exploration. Next time, Siege of Leningrad, survival against all odds. You won't believe what happened there.